Erev Tov, everyone, and welcome. The question tonight, or the topic tonight, is about pluralism within Judaism. But the first question, we'll jump right into it, is what is pluralism? So that's source number one, and I'll just read that. Now, this is from a bigger article, but the definition here of pluralism is pretty much the one that you're going to find in almost every or most articles, which it just says, pluralistic Judaism holds that one's religious beliefs are not the exclusive source of truth, and that some level of truth and value exists in other denominations and religions. Now, obviously, there's a lot to unpack here, and throughout the course of this class, we'll have a chance to think about what this means. And not only is it true of Judaism, but do we want it to be true to Judaism? So the word plural, just from a very simple standpoint, if you have, a dog and then you add an S, it becomes dogs. So it means more than one of something. Now, plurality can apply to many different places. It can be in interfaith. You can say that every religion has a truth or a value to it, but the focus that we're going to go on tonight is on specifically within Judaism. We actually did a class on interfaith relations and the relations between other religions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and everything like that. That's more complicated. And part of that has to do with the fact that the Torah has a pretty clear opinion about what the faith of the Jews are, and a pretty clear opinion of other religions, at least ones that are considered idolatry. Now, the relationships between Judaism and other religions is much better today than it was classically, because many religions, if not all religions today, aren't really idolatry. But in terms of the value of pluralism that many Jews hold, in the interfaith sphere, it's not as widespread. But within Judaism, the idea of pluralism between denominations, basically Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, all those different variations, many hold that that is indeed a Jewish value. So that's the first distinction here. Pluralism can apply in many different areas, but for Jews, many claim that plurality, or the idea that different denominations have a value, have something to teach each other, should be respected, is a Jewish reality, is a Jewish value. Plurality between other faiths is a little bit murkier. So that's what we're focusing on, plurality specifically within Judaism. And again, this definition talks about the religious beliefs. So we're not talking here about objective facts, about what's the rate acceleration of gravity, or scientific things like that. We're talking about religious values. How does one connect with God? How should one observe a religious life? How should Shabbat and Kashrut and all of these religious laws fit into one's religious life? So what we'll discuss tonight is it possible for someone who's an Orthodox Jew to see value? And here they're very careful with some level of truth, but to see that the other movements, the other denominations have something to add, that they're not a mistake, that they're not bad in some way. So the way we're going to explore it is really in two different ways. One is we're going to look at some of the most classic sources in the Talmud and look at the idea of, or establish the idea that plurality, the idea that there can be multiple practices, multiple understandings, is a part of our tradition. Then we're going to look at two more contemporary sources. One of them is going to further explore that idea of plurality of opinion and observance, and whether or not that's, and I won't even say a Jewish value, I'll say a Jewish reality. And then the last source that we'll look at is from an Orthodox source that kind of, gives their opinion on what they think if plurality is good or not. And then we'll have time to sort of unpack it. But before we even jump into it, I actually want to open it up to the group and ask the question, and everyone take a moment to think about it. Do you think that Judaism is a pluralistic religion, fundamentally, at its core? Do you think not whether it should be, whether it is? Do you see Judaism as being pluralistic, that fundamentally at its core, it believes that it's okay for everybody to have different opinions and varied practices, et cetera, like that? So think on it for a moment. And if you want to throw up your hand, I'd love to hear some thoughts on it. And again, it's not whether you think it should be, it's whether you think it is at its core. Thoughts? Excellent. Okay, Leon, gonna go ahead and unmute you. Yeah, go ahead, unmute yourself. Yeah, please, Leon.
This is one of the things I was thinking about from last week. I mean, I'm not sure that Judaism really is pluralistic religion, accepts variety. And one of the problems with Rabbi Meir Kahana, from what I gather from reading his stuff and hearing him and so on, is that he believes that Orthodox Judaism has the truth, else is false, and he's the only Jewish person I know of who confronted the world that way and really tried to put it out there. I mean, I know there are other Jews who believe that, but they tend to keep it in the house.
Yeah.
And he was the only one who kind of like tried to stick it in people's faces.
So I'll put this question back on you. So
Mhm.
Meir Kahana was a rabbi. He studied in yeshiva. He was Ashkenazi. So he's at the house Pesach with a Sephardic family, and they're eating rice, which he does not do on Pesach. Do you think Rabbi Meir Kahana would say that person is not a Jew and them eating rice is not valid?
I do not think he would say that. However, if he went to ended up at some Reform Jewish house and they tried to do a feminist Seder on him, he'd probably scream about it.
So that maybe their plurality is a part of our tradition, but maybe there's some limit on it. Excellent. Thank you, Leon. Tamar, yes, just got to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Please.
You had always different groups within Judaism, Pushim, Tzdukim. Later during the Hashmoneans period, you had other groups, the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim. They are all Orthodox. I don't know about among Sfaradim what the divisions were, but among the Orthodox Jews in Europe, you always had different groups, and one claimed against the other that they are not true Jews.
Yeah. No, so that's okay. So exactly your point there. All these groups that you mentioned often fought with each other vehemently. The Pharisees, the Prushim, said that the Saddukim, the Sadducees, are not real Judaism, and they're bad, and they're destroying us, and they're evil, which sounds like, no, there's no room for pluralism. It's our way or the highway. Hasidim and the Mitnagdim, the opposers who are against this new 19th century or 18th century movement towards this more mystical Judaism, or at least this, more loose, however you want to define Hasidism, but it's not authentic Judaism. We have to fight it in all its shape and form. So if we think that the hatred or the vitriol between Orthodoxy and Reform is bad, you could look at some things in history where it was really bad, where the groups were turning each other over to the government so they could be thrown in jail or even worse, executed. But if you look at from that point of history, then it seems like absolutely not. There's no pluralism whatsoever. But if you look back in the Talmud, you start to see a different picture take shape. And Leon's question, or Leon's point about an extreme figure like Meir Kahana, who would say, no, Sephardim can eat rice, but a feminist Seder is not acceptable. The question that we'll kind of explore is, are there limits? Are there limits to how far pluralism could go if it's a Jewish value? So the first thing we're going to do is look at, it's actually one long Talmudic source. And the reason I brought one long one is because I think it so beautifully goes through really all the topics we're discussing. Now, there are a lot that I didn't bring in here, but I'll just mention some. The most classic source, and I actually will mention here, is Shammai and Hillel. And one of the things between Shammai and Hillel, both the rabbis and their academies, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, is that, well, they actually didn't disagree as much as people say. It was only a handful of arguments. Some say the people, Shammai and Hillel themselves, only disagreed about 4 things. But ultimately, even though they disagreed about fundamental things about purity and impurity and marriage and identity, their daughters still married each other. And that was actually it's a very beautiful source because it points out that you can fundamentally disagree with someone and still embrace them as part of your community and still see them as family. But this next source, I think, goes even a step further. And Elizabeth, I'm going to have you, it's quite long, so I might have more than one person read it. And there's a phrase in Aramaic that basically translates, that's beginning here, that each river follows its own course. And that's kind of what's happening here in this source. So I'll explain it more when we go into it. But go ahead, Elizabeth, from Yevamot from the Talmud Bavli, please. According to
Rabbi,
one.
I appreciate your asking me, but I have some ointment in my eyes.
Oh, no worries.
I'll
Then you
pass.
close your eyes, sit back and relax, and Jane Avner will read to us. She'll serenade us with these words.
Okay, from Yevamot. According to the one who said that Beit Shammai acted in accordance with their opinion, we should read here, "You shall not cut yourselves," from Deuteronomy, which is interpreted to mean, do not become numerous factions. Abaye said, when we say that the prohibition, "you shall not cut yourself," applies, we are referring to a case where two courts are located in one city, and these rule in accordance with the statement of Beit Shammai, and those rule in accordance with the statement of Beit Hillel. However, with regard to two courts located in two different cities, we have no problem with it.
So pause there for a moment. So the verse they're bringing, really just the two words they're bringing from Dvarim, lo titkodedu, do not cut yourselves, is actually referring to the mitzvah of not cutting one's flesh after mourning. But they're doing a drash here, and they're saying, do not cut your community apart. In other words, each community should have one governing body. So if you have one community, and here the towns weren't so big. It wasn't, Milwaukee would have been the biggest city in the world at that time. If you have a small town, don't have two different courts giving two different rulings about what's kosher and not kosher. You need to have a unified town. But if you have Milwaukee and you have Madison, each one can have their own court. And even if they rule differently, that is fine. That's not considered separating the community. So that's the first point there, is this value of unity, but also recognition that each community is a little bit different. So already we see here a little bit of tension, but kind of a compromise, which is we don't have to be the same, but a community should be united. Please continue, Jane, Rava said to him.
I have a question about that, but I think I'll wait.
Okay, please.
To get answered, I guess.
Sure.
Rava said to him, but the dispute between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel is considered like a case of two courts in one city, as these two schools of thought were found everywhere, not in any specific place. Rather, Rava said, when we say that the prohibition, "you shall not cut yourselves," applies, we are referring to a case where there is a court in one city, a section of which rules in accordance with the statement of Beit Shammai, and another section rules in accordance with the statement of Beit Hillel. However, with regard to two courts located in one city, we have no problem with it.
So this refines the question and changes it, which is, the issue is if you have one court, and you could translate one court as a shul. So you don't want to have internal conflict within a shul. So at Lake Park Synagogue, me and the ritual committee, we can obviously argue, but ultimately we need to come out with one ruling. So within our small community, if we say here are 5 different rulings, that's not acceptable. But Lake Park Synagogue does not have to need to have the same rulings as the Witz community or the local Chabad house. So that is even more diverse than, that really opens it up to kind of the variety we have today. So you can have even more than one ruling, more than one custom within a given city, as long as within an individual body, people ultimately, rule the same way. Please continue, unless you have your question is you want to ask it now.
Well, I was just thinking about the acceptance of the Ethiopian way of Judaism, which was different, and it developed differently over time. And then in Israel, insisting that the Ethiopians be educated, and I don't know if they had to convert, but if they had to be more in conformance with Ashkenazi, basically.
A lot of the sources that were actually the last 2 contemporary sources are directly responding to Israel, and basically the tension between the chief rabbinate, the Rabbanut, and how they rule for all these Jews who are completely different from them. And I didn't bring the specific cases, but it's cases of kashrut, cases of conversion are popular. And so we're going to come back to your question there. But a lot of the issues of pluralism specifically come up in Israel because Israel does have a single governing body. And practically each shul, kind of has some leeway, but in America, we don't really have anything like that. Even if Orthodox Jews in America want it to be that way, good luck to them. But we will come back to that. But that really is the $1 million question about why that is today, and is that reflective of the classical Jewish values, and then should it be? And that's a question that is an opinion piece. But yeah, please continue. The Gemara
cites other relevant sources. I'm in here. In the locale of Rabbi Eliezer, where his ruling was followed, they would cut down trees on Shabbat to prepare charcoal from them to fashion iron tools with which to circumcise a child on Shabbat. In Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, not only does the mitzvah of circumcision override Shabbat, but also any action required for the preparation of the tools necessary for the circumcision likewise overrides Shabbat. The Baraita adds, in the locale of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, they would eat poultry meat in milk, as Rabbi Yosei HaGalili held that the prohibition of meat in milk does not include poultry.
So that chicken parm he would have, but that's a big deal because the Gemara seems to be validating or saying that this is a valid opinion. In his town, he rules that chicken parm is kosher and there's no issue with that. Now there's stories there. There's a story about that, people didn't, like that, et cetera, like that. But the fact that the Gemara is listing even these minority opinions as valid, it's that there is a plurality of practices, including things today that pretty much most Jews, whether or not they keep kashrut, would agree that these are, verboten. We wouldn't do this. If somebody keeps Jewish law, they wouldn't eat chicken parm. If someone eats chicken parm, it's because they're choosing not to keep kashrut. But to have these variations is pretty wild. Please continue, Jane.
The Gemara infers in the locale of Rabbi Eliezer, yes, they would act in this manner. Whereas in the locale of Rabbi Akiva, for instance, no, they would not do so. As it is taught in a Baraita that a principle was stated by Rabbi Akiva, any prohibited labor that can be performed on Shabbat Eve does not override Shabbat, even if it involves a mitzvah. A mitzvah whose proper time is on Shabbat overrides Shabbat only if its performance was impossible earlier. In other words, the act of circumcision itself, which cannot be performed earlier. The Gemara asks, and what is this refutation? As stated above, it is different when dealing with numerous places, and the Baraita explicitly states that this practice was followed in Rabbi Eliezer's locale. Consequently, there is no violation of the prohibition against splitting into factions. The Gemara asks, he who asked it, why did he ask it? In other words, what is the basis for the question in the first place? It is obvious that the Baraita is referring to a specific place.
And then it's going to respond to that question. Go ahead.
The Gemara answers, it might enter your mind to say that due to the severity of Shabbat, it, in other words, the world, is considered like a single locale. In other words, one might have thought that the permission to tolerate diverse customs in different places applies only to other prohibitions, whereas the prohibition of Shabbat is so severe that it is unacceptable to allow different customs, as this might lead people to disrespect Shabbat. Therefore, the Baraita teaches us that even in the case of Shabbat, there can be different customs in various locales.
This is a very, very powerful idea in response to that previous paragraph, which is that we established two principles here. One is that it is totally fine to have different practices in different locales, potentially even within the same general city, as long as it's two, different bodies that are not arguing directly with each other. But the other thing is say, fine, you have different customs for Sephardim and Ashkenazim about eating rice on Pesach, but when it comes to bread, everybody agrees on that, and generally everyone does agree on that. But Shabbat, there's only one way to keep Shabbat. And we're not going to allow for any variation because it's Shabbat, it's a Torah mitzvah. And it says, no, even within the most important mitzvot from the Torah, it's okay to have variation. It's okay to have fundamentally different opinions. This rabbi could say, I think that rabbi, what they're doing is totally against Shabbat, but I can still validate that it's an acceptable opinion. And this, again, goes back to a famous Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai debate where they argued for years. And then a heavenly voice came down and said, Elu ve'elu, Elokim Chaim, these divrei Elokim Chaim, both these opinions of your school and your school are all words of the living God. They're all valid opinions. Now, generally we rule by Beit Hillel because of their methodology, they're down to earth, their characteristics, they're nice people, as it were. But at the end of the day, what Shammai says is totally valid and it's 100% kosher. And it's okay to have more than one opinion. And don't say that there's a limit. There's certain areas where we all have to agree, like conversion or Shabbat. There's no room for it. Yes, there is. There's absolutely room for it. Now, there still may be some limits that we'll come to later. But again, for those who say with Shabbat, all Jews, absolutely, there's only, that a Tesla is an electric car and electricity is only forbidden rabbinically, and for a rabbi to ever rule that maybe riding a Tesla on Shabbat is technically permitted, they're obviously an idolater and destroying Judaism. I don't think this opinion would validate that. If it's within the realm of Torah opinion and there's valid opinions to back it up, why, if it's right for a community, go for it. Would I, a modern Orthodox rabbi, ever rule that in my community? Probably not. But could I respect that other communities rule that way and that they're still Jewish and it's still a valid form of Judaism? Maybe. Does that mean I'm saying right now I validate all of Reform and Conservative? That's another conversation for another time. But this opens up the door that you can respect what other communities do, even if you would never do it in your own. And I want to let that point sink in. It's possible to never to have your own practice and to not say that you ever want to practice like the other person, but still to respect that that is appropriate for their community. And to even say, I disagree with them and I don't think that's the right way to do it, but that's their way to do it. It's possible to do that. But we have a few more examples. And Jane, you've done such an excellent idea. I'll let you take it home. The Gemara cites.
The Gemara cites another relevant case involving Shabbat. Come and hear that Rabbi Abahu, when he happened to come to the place of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, would move an oil lamp, shuraga, after the flame had been lit for that Shabbat had burnt out, as Rabbi Yehoshua accepted the ruling that it is permitted to carry items of this sort that had been set aside. But when he happened to come to the place of Rabbi Yochanan, who prohibited carrying items of this kind that had been set aside on Shabbat, he would not move an oil lamp. This indicates that divergent customs are followed in different places.
And again, this is such a beautiful, it's not even validating the other. It's when you go to their community to potentially, and this one is a little bit trickier if you're in America or Israel, but like that you can follow another place's customs. So for example, in the Orthodox world, there's a general accepted law that an observant Jew will not go into a church or a Buddhist temple or something like that. And the reasons for it are varied. We've given a class on that. Most likely just so no one thinks that they're going to pray there. But in Great Britain, the chief rabbi will go into the church for certain things. So are we going to say he's not Orthodox because he does that? What if an Orthodox Jew doesn't do it, and then they go to Great Britain and the chief rabbi invites him to come along? Are they going to say, oh, it's completely forbidden, how dare you do that? I don't think they would. But again, the problem with people, what plurality forces us to do is the people that say there's absolutely only one way to do it and we have the only truth whatsoever. You really push and say, actually, let's open up the Shulchan Aruch. Let's open up the rabbinic sources and see, is there really just one way to do it? And when you actually bring the sources and point them out, they're going to hem and haw and say, well, I see your point here. Now, again, Reform and Conservative Judaism, or particularly Reform, it does look a little bit different than having a halachic debate based on different opinions within the Talmudic text. So we will come back to that. But the language, the tenor throughout the Talmud is that varying practices are okay, and one should and does respect them. Again, we marry each other's daughters. So, the child of a Reformed couple, whether or not they're observant, if their daughter's Jewish, why not marry her? So those are the things that are really important, is we can still be a loving community even if we don't recognize or validate or accept the rulings of others. We can still accept them. So go ahead, Jane, and finish off this source in the Talmud.
Again, the Gemara asks, and what is this difficulty? Didn't we say it is different when dealing with numerous places? The Gemara explains that this is what we are saying. With regard to Rabbi Abahu himself, how could he act in this manner here, and how can he act in that manner there? The Gemara answers, Rabbi Abahu holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi that it is permitted to carry this item. And when he happened to come to the place of Rabbi Yochanan, he would not carry it in deference to Rabbi Yochanan, so as not to act contrary to his ruling in the place where he was the authority. The Gemara asks, but there was a servant accompanying Rabbi Abahu who would see him carrying these types of articles that had been set aside. Wasn't Rabbi Abahu concerned that the servant might carry them in Rabbi Yochanan's locale? The Gemara explains that he would inform the servant and explain to him the reason for his change in behavior.
Excellent, thank you. So we have this concern in Jewish law about if people see us doing something we shouldn't do anyway, we should be strict in every second. No, you can explain to someone, but the real important takeaway of this last paragraph is the phrase in Hebrew, mishum kvodo. Why would he change his practice? Out of respect, out of honor for the other person, for another human being. And if we ended here, the kind of attacks that we see from typically, you know what, I don't want to just pick on the Orthodoxy, which I am a member of. You know, we often think it's the Orthodox that hate everyone else, but there are plenty of Reform Jews or non-observant Jews or unaffiliated Jews that think the Orthodox are crazy and awful. Now, within every group, there are those who are extreme, and I don't think it has to do with their philosophy or practice. It has to do with them as people. But ultimately, if every group said, look, I'm not going to practice your way, but I respect that that's right for your community, my goodness, how much better could we get along? But unfortunately, that's not the reality that at least we seem to have today. So before we go on to the next source, I want to ask if there are any questions, thoughts, or comments on this source. And thank you, Jane, for reading such a big source.
It's a pleasure.
Excellent. I'll pause, see if there's any questions. Beautiful. So this next source here, oh, somebody.
Susan.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
Susan, go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, I've just, in line with this, I have spoken to people at Chabad, and I've been told that when something comes up, they'll say, oh, we don't do that. It's not, you're wrong to do that, it's forbidden, blah, 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 just we don't do that.
Yeah, and
Which I
that
think is a
kind
really
of,
nice, yeah.
no, I love that. I love to hear that. And I think Chabad, of all the Orthodox Hasidic groups, has developed that kind of sensitivity because they want to be part of this world. There are Orthodox groups that choose to, you know, completely separate themselves out, and they might say some very negative things, but Chabad recognizes that, you know, you catch more flies with honey, which doesn't need a hechsher. And a really good example of this is actually with kashrut, where if there's a restaurant that has, you know, it's under the laws of kashrut, but it's not to the level of observance and relies on the same rulings that someone does, no rabbi who's respectful and a good rabbi is going to say, oh, it's not kosher. They'll say, I choose not to eat there. I wouldn't suggest holding by that. Now, there's certain implications there, but at the end of the day, that's very different than saying it's not kosher. So, for example, there are certain kosher symbols, hechshers, that, you know, my family doesn't eat. You know, I wouldn't allow into, you know, the synagogue where I'm the rabbi. But if someone is eating it, that's fine. And even though I wouldn't eat it myself, I would still eat in their kitchen. That's how far I would go in recognizing that there's a plurality of different halachic opinions. So this next source here is from a rabbi, not an Orthodox rabbi, but he's a brilliant rabbi in his articles of historical and classical sources. And here it's just kind of a taste. I didn't bring all the sources he brought because they're just so many, but it goes to a lot of his conclusions. And here's his question: is Judaism really in favor of pluralism and tolerance? Just because we've seen some examples of it, which I would argue really shows that at our core, the idea of recognizing different practices, different opinions is okay, even, and it comes from a place of respect and recognizing that, you know, there's more than one way to read the Torah. Is it a fundamental value? So Leon, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this source number one, please. The dangers of disunity.
The dangers of disunity. This midrash warns us that the lack of unity between Joseph and his brothers led to tragedy. If not for the senseless enmity between Joseph and his brothers, Joseph would not have been sold into slavery in Egypt, and the children of Israel would not have been enslaved there for 400 years. This is one of the basic lessons of Jewish history. Internal disunity leads to tragedy, destruction, and exile. We have thus far seen that the Jewish tradition is opposed to disunity and strives for unity. One could easily conclude from these sources that the best way to achieve unity is by uniformity. If we all think the same and act the same, then we will be united.
Pause there for a moment. So these ellipses here, he brought like half a dozen examples from the Talmud and Midrashic sources that said, in this town, you know, the community was arguing about an opinion, and then this horrible tragedy happened. So again, if you just looked at those sources, it would sound like every town, all Jews should have one opinion, one ruling, one orthodoxy, one right way of thinking, or it will bring destruction. But he continues, however,
However, nothing could be further from the approach of our classic sources. Our sages thought and taught that pluralism is essential when studying Torah among people and within Jewish law.
Pause there, sorry for one moment. So after this ellipsis, he brought all these different sources, like in the original, but what he's about to do here is mention what the point of each of these sources. What comes out of them is all these ideas that basically the Torah has more than one, in fact, dozens, in fact, 70 ways to understand it. So here he's going to summarize the points that came out of all the sources that he brought. Go ahead, please. The Torah is
pluralistic by its very nature. It has 70 faces and divides into many sparks, and God spoke to every Jew at Mount Sinai, but each one heard and understood something different. Not only is it permissible to interpret every verse in different ways, but a student is required to study with different rabbis in order to be exposed to different interpretations.
And what's funny, he pointed out that source, I don't remember exactly, I think it was Avot Rabbi Natan, mentioned, which is a midrashic source, the idea that everybody should actually go out of their way to hear different opinions and different interpretations. But then there's a version of the text that says the opposite. So within the source that values pluralism, there's the source arguing with it, which is basically just another source for pluralism, which is there's more than one opinion there. And it's very, with the number of different interpretations, Rashi, the great commentary, the great French commentator, who himself will bring multiple interpretations on a single verse, shows that there's absolutely different truth and different value in different communities. And you have thousands of years of this, including rabbis in the last several hundred years, quoting Christian scholars in different interpretations. You may not find that as much today. And again, we're going to get to modern times, like contemporary times, but up till this point, there's absolutely more than one way to understand the Torah. Now, everyone's starting with the same core text, but the truth is, even Reform, Reconstructionist, secular humanistic Judaism, they are all still ultimately starting with the same kind of general text, the Mishnah, etc. Where they go with it is varied, but that seems to be an absolute value in Judaism, that you not only can have different interpretations, you really should. You can never really appreciate the Torah until you've looked at it in dozens of ways. But he's going to ask a very important question. Fine, you're sitting in the Beit Midrash in the yeshiva, you're teaching a class, you're saying, oh, there's different ways to understand eye for an eye. That's great. But what about actual practical nuts and bolts, getting down to brass tacks? So go ahead, Leon, please. Section C, pluralism in Jewish law.
Pluralism in Jewish law, how so? One might reply to the above. Pluralism in interpretations of biblical verses is fine. Pluralism in human beings is fine, but what about Jewish practice? Don't we all have to observe the same laws and customs? Let us look at a classic passage in the Jerusalem Talmud, Sanhedrin, that's chapter 4, line 2 or something.
Chapter 4, Mishnah 2, because in the Jerusalem Talmud, they do it by chapter and Mishnah.
All right, Rabbi Yanai said, if the Torah had been given sliced, that is a one clear answer to every question, there would be no room for the leg to stand, that is, no room to maneuver. How do we know this? And God spoke to Moses, saying, Moses said, Lord of the universe, tell me what is the halacha? God said, follow the majority, Exodus 23:2. If those who acquit are in the majority, acquit. If those who find guilty are in the majority, find guilty, so that the Torah will be interpreted 49 faces impure, 49 faces pure. In other words, Moses wanted God to give him a clear answer to every question. God replied that the sages of every generation must debate every issue and decide by majority vote what to do. Indeed, we know from a number of famous stories in the Talmud that this is what the sages did. After debating an issue and arriving at a majority opinion, they would force the minority to follow their opinion. I'll skip the sources.
That's
here.
fine. However, yeah.
However, after the era of the Sanhedrin or Jewish parliament around 425 CE, there was no longer one group of rabbis who could decide by majority vote. As a result, Jewish law became much more pluralistic. The fact that a rabbi or a group of rabbis rules in a certain way does not mean all Jews will do or must do what they say. Throughout Jewish history, contradictory halakhic rulings coexisted side by side. A Sephardic Jew who disobeyed an Ashkenazi rabbi was not a sinner. He was simply relying on a different custom or rabbi. In conclusion, the attempt of certain Orthodox rabbis in Israel to impose their specific halakhic opinion on all the Jews of Israel and the diaspora contradicts the way Jewish law has worked since the dissolution of the Sanhedrin.
Excellent. So there's two very important points here. One is about truth in general. And again, the word truth, there are people, oh, there's alternate truth and stuff like that. When you confuse truth with a fact that is provable, that's not what we're talking about here. If somebody did something, if, there's some things that you can prove or disprove, that's a fact. That's a factual truth. But here we're talking about ritual religious things, about custom, etc., like that. And the point is that there's more than one religious truth from the Torah. There's more than one way to practice a custom, understand a law, etc., like that, and they're all valid. However, democracy is also a value within Jewish law. It's written into the Torah, lehatot acharei harabim, to go after the majority, the rabim, which at some point when we had a recognized unified body that ultimately could trace their authority back to Moshe, to Moses, fine. The Sanhedrin would make a democratic vote, just like we live in a democratic society. So this is a value that we as Americans and many other societies can validate. Even if we think a ruling is bad or dumb, and we can push it, we have ways to push against it. But ultimately, majority rules, there's a democratic process, hopefully a wise one that makes a lot of sense and is appropriate for most people. Not for everyone, but for most people. So with the Sanhedrin, yeah, there was one practice. But even the fact that there was one practice was based on the idea that it was not, there was more than one way to understand the Torah, but to unify the community, we're going to vote on which of those to choose. But the understanding that fundamentally there could be one more valid way to do it. But once the Sanhedrin was dissolved, so we're talking 425 CE, so we're talking, over 1,600 years ago, actually not quite 1,600 years ago, a little shy of 1,600 years ago, shy by 2 years. Once that was dissolved, every community could, I don't want to say they could do anything they wanted, but ultimately every community could do what they want and voted what was appropriate for them. And to say that there is one truth for every single Jew, one practice, is contradictory to the way that Jewish law has developed. And again, if you actually look through the development of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, all the rabbis and stuff, there's some really, knockdown, drag out fights about what's true and how to practice and saying horrible things about each other. But these are all the classical sources that Orthodox Jews respect today. So when you get to modern Judaism, and it's printed in certain Orthodox publishing that there's one way to understand it, one way for kashrut, that is completely, I don't want to say antithetical, but kind of to the way Jewish law is developed. A recognition that there's more than one way, and there should be a different practice for each community. Now, we're still going to come back to some of those fundamental questions. Fine, Rabbi. You've shown that throughout Judaism and classical sources, the idea is there can be more than one way to decide whether you eat rice on Pesach. Nobody's going to argue that. But there's certain groups in Judaism that deny that the Torah was given by God, deny that God even exists. How can we have plurality with them? We're going to leave that till the end. We're going to look at one more source, which really pushes back on all of this. But as you're reading through it, and I did bring the full source, but as you're reading through it, you're like, that something is off about this. Your arguments are really weak here. So the arguments in this section for plurality in Judaism are pretty strong, and they're well sourced. The next section that we're going to bring is not very well sourced, and it's one of those things where they know where they wanted to end up, and then they kind of needed to put together an argument for why plurality is bad. So before we go to that, any questions on this source? Excellent. Oh, I heard a throat clearing. All right, beautiful. All right, so this last source here is from a magazine, Jewish Action, printed by the Orthodox Union. This article, I think, is from 1997, so that's a lifetime ago. But I'll read this one. So the article again is talking about conversion, and specifically in Israel, and the issue of should the Israeli rabbinate, the Orthodox, recognize conversions done by non-Orthodox groups. And again, one of these things that's not part of this article at all, or not part of this discussion at all, is let's actually look at the laws of conversion and what the standards are and what the Talmud says and start our conversation there. Their conversation has to do with one thing. Was it an Orthodox rabbi? But what if the conservative Jews are doing it according to, I don't care, they're conservative. That's kind of the understanding that is behind this. And it really weakens the argument. It doesn't leave room for any kind of discussion. Now, there are some positive, lovely ideas in here, but this attack on plurality, it's very weak. If somebody's going to say that plurality is, first of all, is plurality exist in Judaism and is it a value? Yeah. Should it be a value? This article is going to argue no. But their reasons for it are weak, and we'll come back to that. So I'm starting in the middle of the article because I think it hits some of the main points. Is Orthodoxy trying to delegitimize Reform and conservative Jews? No. All Reform and conservative Jews born Jewish, and they're very careful with their language there. So, if it's a Jewish father but a non-Jewish mother, oh, that doesn't count. Or converted halachically are Jews. So basically, we don't, the entire movements are delegitimized. That's what they're saying. All of reform and conservative movement, they're not Judaism whatsoever. But the Jews, as long as they had an Orthodox conversion, even if they're practicing Reform now, or their mother is completely Jewish, then of course they're Jewish. Halacha requires that the prospective convert accept Ol Malchut Shamayim, the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, the conviction to live a life based upon accepting the yoke of servitude to God and his mitzvot. The 613 mitzvot are not a pick and choose smorgasbord. Torah observance dictates an all or nothing approach to enter the Jewish nation. It is far from pluralistic, but it is this unswavering loyalty to Torah law that has secured our existence for over 3,000 years. There's so many issues with how this is stated. Now, on the one hand, it does, as they appear, the Torah does expect that Jews accept the Torah of God. So from that perspective, if you say, yes, classically, the Torah presented by God expects us to keep it. How we keep it, though, that is very open to debate. And the issue is when someone says, the halacha says, excuse me, what do you mean the halacha says? Do you mean Ashkenazi halacha according to Eastern European, Latvian customs as gone through this particular community in this particular case? Then fine, that halacha rules in this way. But the problem is if you say that Judaism asks for an observant life, okay, I'll buy that. But to say that there's one way to do that is so disingenuous and dangerous and weakens all of us and creates all of these issues. And I myself have come up against this where, I'll do something I'll go to 5 rabbis, make sure it's totally valid within Shulchan Aruch, classical sources, 100%. It may not be, but one particular ultra-Orthodox community does, and because it's not valid and I'm a heretic. That's insane. That is completely against all of what Judaism has been for ages. So I really push back on statements like this. Again, there's some truth to it. Like we started with pluralism there's some truth to what you say, but to say that there's one halacha is so disingenuous, so incorrect, and so damaging to the Jewish people. So it continues. Isn't pluralism important for Jewish unity? Can't Jews get along? And again, these are such loaded questions, the way they're saying it. Religious pluralism and Jewish unity are not synonymous. Despite the fact that core differences exist between Jews, Jewish unity requires that we look for shared principles and work together in these areas, rather than try to delegitimize anyone. That's lovely, but you just did. You completely delegitimized 2 massive denominations. So you say, oh, let's not attack each other. I mean, I'm not going to attack you because nothing you do is valid whatsoever, but you shouldn't attack me. Like, they're undermining their very point here. Religious pluralism in this context implies that one party, namely the Orthodox, must compromise its core principles and thereby delegitimize the institution of the chief rabbinate. When I read this, I just wanted to I don't have much hair left, but I wanted to pull it out. This is actually a problem here in the States. It is possible for other people to have a right to do something that you don't think should be done. You know what you should do? Don't do it. It's fine. Now, conversion is a little bit trickier because of the potential issue of I choose to accept one form of conversion, and I only want my daughter or my son to marry someone who goes by that standard. That's a valid concern that many Orthodox have said is it's not about the denominations. It's I want my child to marry someone who I consider and we consider to be halachically Jewish. That's fine. That's a valid conversation to have. Not really what they're doing here. They are fundamentally saying that it's really our way or the highway. The only authentic way is this one way, and everybody has to do it our way because we refuse to compromise. And if you practice any differently, somehow that means that we can't practice fully. Again, that's ridiculous. That is ridiculous. Just because you choose or believe that you are not allowed to eat shellfish, just because a Jew does, you can say to them, I believe Jewish law says we shouldn't eat shellfish. That's how my understanding of it. And I'm not going to eat shellfish. And if you eat it, I believe that you're wrong, but that's your understanding and that's your choice to do. I might say, can you show me your evidence? Can you argue why you think eating shellfish is fine? Then we have a discussion there. But again, this idea that just because other Jews practice differently, therefore that somehow undermines my ability to be observant is really ridiculous. Again, conversion can be a little trickier because of identity and marriages. But again, this whole argument is just, it falls apart very quickly. And I welcome people at the end to push back on what I'm saying. In our meetings with Israeli leaders, we have constantly reiterated that while we disagree vehemently with reform and conservative leadership on pluralism, and that's fine, you're allowed to do that. There's nothing wrong. You can disagree till the cows come home. We still endeavor to work together in the many areas of concern to all Jews, including assimilation, intermarriage, anti-Semitism, and anti-terrorism. And by the way, I think that is what people should do, is let's focus on things that can bring us together, but let's not delegitimize each other because we don't agree about that. We don't agree with your practice in this area. So why do we continue? So this is an interesting question. If the OU or the person who wrote this article thinks that all these other denominations are just not, they're not Judaism. They might be Jews, but they're not Judaism. And it's no different than working with a Catholic church with a bunch of people converted to Catholicism who are technically Jewish. Why is it different? So why do we continue to work with Reform and conservative leaders on other issues while the pluralism question remains unresolved? And again, these are the good questions to ask. Let's see what their answer is. The Union, meaning the Orthodox Union's leadership, feels it is imperative that all Jews keep the lines of communication open and search for a common ground. Okay. One example of joint effort is the Memorial Foundation, which handles German reparations to Holocaust survivors and or their families, where all Jewish organizations from Reform to World Agudah work together. This is great. I wouldn't personally choose to go pray in a Reform synagogue where men and women pray together. I wouldn't, that's not my practice. That's not valid for me. But that's their choice, and that's great for them. However, the fact that a Reform congregation does that does not undermine or delegitimize my choice. What is a great example of that? The Western Wall. The fact that there's an area there where women and men can pray together, or that women can read from the Torah. How on earth does that take away from you choosing to not do that? Again, the answer for that gets into politics and culture. And again, there are answers to my questions, but fundamentally, in the classical way that Jewish law has developed, it doesn't. Just because women read from the Torah, which really has a strong basis, even in the Talmud, and I choose to not do that, not participate in that, it doesn't affect me in any real way. If I want it to affect me, and I make it about power and control, which is unfortunately what it's often about, then it's a problem. But if it's a matter of there's different practices, they do what they do, I do what I do, and we all come together for for a Tu B'Shvat Seder, which is a great way for denominations to join together, then we're all winners. But if I say that everybody has to do it, if they do anything Jewish, it has to be my way, that's really damaging. And he actually mentioned in this article, he said, oh, there's this popular, legend that if you go to any Israeli and you ask them about going to shul, they say, I don't go to shul, but the shul that I don't go to is Orthodox. I don't think that's so true, but the fact that this article claims that as a possible truth is very disturbing. It might be that when secular Israeli Jews choose to engage with Judaism, they go to Orthodoxy. Part of that is because Reform and conservative are not big in Israel. They're growing, but they're not really an option there, and they may not understand the movements. If conservative Reform Judaism were bigger in Israel, you might find that more secular Israelis might be more engaged with Judaism because they find a Judaism that works more with their choice of life. How cool would that be if you could actually get Jews closer to Judaism instead of saying it's all or nothing. How does that help people? So I'll go ahead and finish the article. We must not allow we must also remember that there are many Jewish communities throughout the world, and especially the United States, where the success of institutions such as the mikvah or Chevra Kadisha requires communal cooperation. We must not allow our disagreements to harm Jewish institutions or a response to Jewish needs. That is great, but unfortunately, that's not what's happening. The fights of the orthodoxy on kashrut, on conversion, on mechitza, on women's role in Judaism really does damage institutions and people's ability to connect to Judaism. They're pushing people away. Now, again, if you say, Rabbi Dinan, can a Jew eat pork? Is there a valid opinion for that? I would say, no, there's not. You're welcome to try and convince me. I don't think you can, but that's not the point here. I choose to not do it. That's how I teach my community, but every community is different. Every community is different. We must differentiate between the professional religious leadership of the Reform and conservative movements and their laity. And this is a classic thing: is don't attack Reform Jews, attack Reform rabbis. And again, there's so much damaging about that. Even if I also disagree with virtually everything they as a movement and their philosophy, I recognize that, again, there's more than one possible way to live Judaism. And especially if their goal is to live a Jewish life and to bring people closer to Judaism. Do I think that it would be great if Reform Jews chose to keep more Shabbat and more kashrut? Yes. But at the end of the day, unless a Jewish denomination comes out that says our goal is to destroy Torah, worship, and other gods, which essentially is kind of Messianic Judaism, that's not Judaism. That's outside the pale. And we're going to come back to that because the question Leon sort of raised at the beginning is there a limit on this? I just stated I think there's a limit there. I think it has to do ultimately with what your goal is. So I'll go ahead and conclude. We should have no illusions of convincing the leadership that patrilineal descent, non-halachic conversions, intermarriage, alternative lifestyles, and marriages done in conjunction with non-Jewish clergy threaten Jewish survival. So it says, these are the things we're just not going to agree on, so leave it aside. And again, they don't. The fact that they mentioned it here was their kind of passive-aggressive way of sort of attacking the other denominations. However, we must not abandon our commitment to unify Am Yisrael, the nation of Jews, by reaching out to their grassroots members and bringing them closer to a Torah way of life. Again, this article is kind of a mixed bag because practically they're saying we do work with other denominations. If there's a Reform rabbi, a Reform congregation, and it's going to help bring in charity to help support Ukrainians or Ukrainian Jews or whatever like that, fine, we'll work together. Good, great. Are we going to agree with how to have a Shavuot learning session? Maybe not. That's fine. We don't need to. But again, what they do over there does not have to destroy what you do in your congregation. So this article tries to have it both ways. We're going to delegitimize them, but they better not delegitimize us. So now that we've seen that, now I actually want to stop sharing the screen, and I want to invite people for the last part of the class to unmute and hear people's thoughts on that last piece, and whether you feel that pluralism is a Jewish value, should continue to be a Jewish value, and specific. So one, do you think having heard this, it is indeed a Jewish value? Two, should it be a Jewish value? Have things changed? So maybe pluralism is not good for our people. And three, what was the third thing? Three, are there limits on pluralism? I already mentioned one, and again, all of you are welcome to push back on my reading of the article or my opinions, but I invite anybody to unmute and share their thought on those three opinions. Is it a Jewish value? Should we continue to push for pluralism? Is a value we want? And three, are there limits on pluralism? Does everyone agree that Messianic Judaism, which is really it is an offshoot of Christianity. It is a Christian missionizing organization. But should that be beyond the pale if they say, no, we're still within Judaism? So I invite people to unmute and share their thoughts. Yeah, Leon, go ahead, and can't find the button for unmute all. So just go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I get the sense that at least in some quarters of the Orthodox community, there is pluralism within certain boundaries or certain presumptions that you have to accept. And I get the sense that a Rabbi Twersky will accept you, but won't accept Rabbi Shapiro or from Congregation Shalom or something. That you have to like in geometry, there are certain postulates you have to accept. But within those postulates, there is some flexibility, but not outside the postulates.
Yeah.
That's
Uh,
your understanding of this?
Very much so. And I would say, I don't know. I've met Robert Tversky, he's very sweet, but I don't know that he would accept me as within the bounds of orthodoxy. The truth is, if he heard my rulings, he might accept me if he met me as a, got to know me as a person. I don't know that for sure, but my institution, my school, which is generally progressive and liberal, may reject me on that. But I don't want to speak ill of him or start any rumors whatsoever. But someone in that ultra-Orthodox world would definitely reject it. But your point is so well taken, because one could take all those Talmudic sources and say, yes, there's pluralism within a certain system. For example, the article from the Schechter Institute, which is a conservative organization, even though that article is brilliant, if you get to read the full version, and it talks about the source that Shivim Panim La Torah, there's 70 faces or facets of the Torah. There's 70, not 71. We're 69, you're 68, you're 54, you're 32, you're 71, so you're outside of it. And I did that. I said that Messianic Judaism, which again, calling it Judaism is, they don't, they call themselves that, but they're really a proselytizing Christian group. But if they want to make that claim, I'm saying, no, they're 71, so they're outside of it. But the question is, how far does that go? So example, women at the wall, women reading Torah, I think it's impossible to argue that that is not within the 70 valid interpretations of the Torah. It's insane to do that. So why do people push out? Because of a rejection of women's roles and cultural things, et cetera, like that. But within the bounds of Jewish law, that's something that it's really hard to argue against. Now, a congregation that has shellfish served at a kiddush, I think that's a little bit harder to argue that it fits within the frame. So when I say that I validate what happens in a Reformed congregation, it's more that I validate that having a liberal, open interpretation of Judaism is a valid path. Am I validating every ruling they come out with? No. Do I think some are wrong? Yes. But again, the Talmud said you can fundamentally, they talk about literally purity and impurity, tahor and tameh, which are so important to the Torah. You can fundamentally disagree with that, and still your daughters and sons can marry each other. So you can, and the Talmud talked about Shabbat. Shabbat is the holiest thing of all. Obviously, on that we have to agree. No, even there's room for interpretation, especially around the area of electricity. There's a lot of room where, again, you'll have some rabbis say electricity is fire, absolutely no electricity whatsoever, and others who are totally orthodox who say you can use a magnetic electric key card in a hotel on Shabbat, and that starts a firestorm of hatred. That's missing the point. That does not fit in with the classical model of Judaism. So why has it gotten so fragmented today? Again, I think you could look at the American model, or the model here in the States in politics. And again, it's not about what people actually think. And if you sit down and have an argument, the truth is somewhere in between. It's more about factionalism and power and who's in control. And very few of the issues we fight about are actually fundamental things that we really disagree on. If you really get down to brass tacks, there's a lot more we have in common, both politically here in the States and within Judaism. But unfortunately, we become so polarized, it's hard to have those conversations. But once you're inside the conversation, there's some pretty wild interpretations, some really crazy minority opinions in the Talmud that are within the realm of Jewish law that no one would ever rule today, but they're part of our tradition, and someone could rule that way. And if we approach Judaism that way, there'd be so much more room for discussion. And I think it would help everybody just come closer to tradition. Yeah, other thoughts on those three questions about limits? Yeah, Susan, please.
I noticed the source talks about unity. We should have Jewish unity, but people always seem to think that the unity should be on their own terms. That let's unite my way, not your way.
Yeah. That's exactly what it said. It says it's about unity as long as Orthodox Judaism doesn't have to compromise on any of their values, and we're in control of the game completely. So yes, very valid point. And again, the Talmud did kind of lay out some groundwork, which is that a self-defined community should find some unity, and the way to find that unity is by democratic values. So congregation shalom can be fundamentally different from Beth Yehuda, But within Congregation Shalom, it's not my way or the highway, or it's not there just has to be one opinion. We have to vote, and then we have to agree to compromise on this path for our congregation. Lake Park Synagogue does that too. I don't do anything by fiat. I talk to the ritual community, I talk to the president, I get a sense of what's appropriate for our community before I make any decisions. But I'm not making a decision for any other community. And now if we had infighting within our shul, which some shuls do have, and that's really, really damaging. But the fact that Lake Park Synagogue, we run our services one way, and then Congregation Shalom, which I believe is a Reformed congregation, they run it a different way. How does that undermine or affect our? So we have no idea I have an idea what goes on there, but it doesn't affect us at all, because hundreds of Jews, I hope hundreds, are showing up for shul on Shabbos. Now, again, if they said, Rabbi Dinan, is it permitted for us to do this in shul? The truth is that reality, there probably is a valid opinion for virtually everything they do there. But Rabbi Dinan, would you allow that in your synagogue? No, because this is the way our community chooses to practice. This is the way that we understand our truth. And if it changes, we'll change. So Susan, that's a great point. Any other final thoughts before we close down for the night?
Yeah, the other thing, I put this in the chat. It's very interesting because there are people in the US Supreme Court who say that the Constitution must be interpreted the way that it was understood in 1787. And here you have rabbis saying, well, things change. And maybe we should tell the Supreme Court that they should follow what the Talmud says.
Yeah, the Judaism of ultra-Orthodoxy today is in many ways as different from classical, from like medieval Judaism or pre-medieval Judaism as, Judaism today is from Christianity or something like that. The interpretations of the laws are constantly changing. Now, there's so much more that we could talk about in this class. Post-Holocaust Judaism, trying to draw lines in the sand, a rejection of modernity, that pluralism was indeed a value and was respected, and now there's a pushback against it because of the damage and the rupture that has happened to our people. But at this point, we still face many challenges. Anti-Semitism is still far from gone, but that kind of rejection of pluralism is not helping us. It's not helping us. Now, are there pluralisms in certain environments where it is uncomfortable? Sure. So don't go there. If somebody forces me and says, well, Rabbi Dinan, pluralism means that you need to daven in a Reformed congregation and you need to eat unkosher food, that's not what the Talmud is talking about. Although it did say if I'm going to someone's community, maybe go by their, out of respect to them. But the Talmud says, in your community, you hold by your community. This community holds by that community. And then even the OU article said there are certain things that you can do together, like Hillel, for example. They have different minions, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, the one I'll be running. That's beautiful that they have a space for each of those. And then they come together. And they did make a decision that the food there would be kosher. So the Rabbanut would say, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make the frummest common denominator so everybody's happy. Now, in the areas of kashrut, which can be damaging, including financially, there's usually, less issues there, but around conversion, again, women's roles, it can really hurt people by saying, let's just do it from because everybody's happy. That's not in a way to approach it. It's okay to say we can be separate for these things. I can love you. You're a Jew. I'm not going to eat with you. I'm not going to pray with you, but I'll do charity with you. I will go bowling with you. I'll be family with you. I'll love you. I'll even talk philosophy with you. I'll do a Tu B'Shvat Seder with you. There are a lot of ways to connect without us having to compromise our values. And just because you're different than I am and exist within the same world I do, doesn't mean that my values are being compromised. It's okay to be separate in certain areas. And again, the Talmud establishes that. You can have two courts within one city as long as each court is unified in itself. So with that, we will formally conclude for tonight.